The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the Pacific Northwest Conference Hall as dozens of military leaders and defense contractors gathered for the most prestigious Veterans Leadership Summit on the West Coast. Among the sea of confident voices, firm handshakes, and commanding presences, Sophia Bennett sat quietly in the back corner, her voice barely above a whisper when she introduced herself. What none of them knew was that this soft-spoken woman carried a call sign that had once made entire battalions hold their breath and generals snap to attention. A call sign that would soon turn their mockery into stunned silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of the Pacific Northwest Conference Hall in Seattle, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. The Northwest Military Leadership Council's annual summit was in full swing, drawing nearly 300 participants from across the military spectrum. Active duty officers, defense contractors, veterans advocacy groups, and civilian leadership experts had all converged for 3 days of networking, presentations, and strategic planning sessions. Sophia Bennett adjusted her simple black blazer and checked her name tag one more time before entering the main reception area. At 34, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that most people mistook for timidity. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her voice, when she spoke, was soft and measured, a stark contrast to the booming personalities that dominated military circles. She'd received the invitation to speak at the summit 6 weeks ago, an opportunity that both thrilled and terrified her. The topic assigned to her was quiet leadership in high-stress environments, which felt both perfectly suited to her style and impossibly daunting given the audience she'd be addressing. As Sophia made her way through the crowd, she couldn't help but notice the immediate dynamics at play. Clusters of participants had already formed around the most charismatic speakers, retired generals with their war stories, defense contractors with their latest technologies, and motivational speakers whose voices could fill an auditorium without a microphone. "Excuse me," she said softly to a registration volunteer, her voice nearly lost in the ambient chatter. "I'm looking for the speaker check-in area." The volunteer, a young man in his 20s wearing a crisp suit, barely looked up from his clipboard. "Speaker check-in?" He glanced at her name tag and frowned. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This is the Military Leadership Summit, not the administrative conference." Sophia felt the familiar flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. "Yes, I'm presenting tomorrow on quiet leadership strategies." Sophia Bennett. The volunteer consulted his list, running his finger down the page with obvious skepticism. Bennett Bennett. "Oh, here you are." His tone suggested surprise, as if he'd expected a mistake. "Conference room B, down the hall to your left. But are you sure you're the right Sophia Bennett? The bio here says you're presenting on combat leadership principles." "That's correct," Sophia replied, her voice remaining steady despite the volunteer's obvious doubts. As she walked away, she caught fragments of his conversation with a colleague. "Can you believe they let someone like that speak at a military summit? She can barely project her voice across a desk, let alone command a room full of generals." The speaker check-in process was equally uncomfortable. Dr. Rachel Turner, the summit's academic coordinator, reviewed Sophia's presentation materials with barely concealed confusion. "Ms. Bennett, I have to ask, your proposed presentation seems quite ambitious for someone with your background. Are you sure you're qualified to speak about combat leadership to this audience? Most of our attendees are expecting insights from people with significant command experience." Sophia kept her voice calm and professional. "I believe my experience is relevant to the topic. Dr. Turner, I've prepared thoroughly, and I'm confident the content will be valuable." Dr. Turner's expression suggested otherwise, but she handed over the technical requirements packet with a tight smile. "Well, we'll see how it goes." Just remember, this audience can be quite demanding. They don't respond well to uncertainty or hesitation. The real trouble began during the opening networking session. Sophia had positioned herself near the coffee station, hoping to engage in quiet conversations with individual attendees rather than trying to compete with the larger, louder groups that dominated the room. That's when she first encountered Lance. Garrett. Lance was everything Sophia wasn't: tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that carried effortlessly across crowded rooms, and a presence that demanded attention. At 45, he was a successful defense contractor who'd built his reputation on aggressive sales tactics and an ability to intimidate competitors into submission. His company, Garrett Strategic Solutions, specialized in training programs for military leadership, and he was one of the summit's premium sponsors. Well, Lance said, approaching the coffee station with two of his associates in tow. What do we have here? Let me guess, you're someone's assistant, right? Taking notes for the real participants. Sophia looked up from adding cream to her coffee, meeting his eyes with quiet dignity. Actually, I'm one of the speakers, Sophia Bennett. Lance's laugh was sharp and dismissive. A speaker? You? He glanced at his associates, who were already smirking. Sweetheart, I've been coming to these summits for 8 years, and I can tell you right now, military leadership isn't about whispering sweet nothings. It's about command presence, authority, the ability to make your voice heard over gunfire and chaos. I understand that perspective, Sophia replied softly, though she could feel heat rising in her cheeks. Do you? Lance stepped closer, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. Because from where I'm standing, you look like someone who'd get overwhelmed ordering coffee at Starbucks, let alone leading soldiers in combat. What's your background anyway? Administrative support? Military spouse? One of Lance's associates, a younger man named Chad Williams, jumped in with obvious glee. Oh, this should be good. Tell us about your extensive combat leadership experience, Ms. Bennett, Sophia said, her voice remaining steady despite the growing audience there. Conversation was attracting. And I think my presentation tomorrow will provide the context you're looking for. Lance's grin widened. Your presentation? Oh, this is rich. What's your topic? How to lead through interpretive dance. Command presence for librarians. The group around them erupted in laughter, and Sophia felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in. This wasn't the first time her quiet demeanor had been mistaken for weakness, but the public nature of the humiliation stung more than usual. Actually, she said, gathering her courage, my topic is quiet leadership in high-stress environments. Lessons from forward operating bases. The laughter died down slightly, but Lance's expression remained mocking. Forward operating bases? You mean you visited some FOBs on a USO tour? Shook hands with some real soldiers, and now you think you understand combat leadership? Sophia felt her jaw tighten, but before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? Everyone turned to see Colonel Frank Morrison approaching, his weathered face set in the kind of expression that had once commanded respect from subordinates across 3 combat deployments. At 58, Morrison carried himself with the quiet authority that came from decades of real leadership experience. Lance immediately shifted gears, extending his hand with practiced politeness. Colonel Morrison. No problem at all. Just getting acquainted with one of the speakers. Lance Garrett, Garrett Strategic Solutions. Morrison shook Lance's hand briefly, but his attention was focused on Sophia. And you are? Sophia Bennett. She replied, her voice soft but clear. I'm presenting tomorrow on quiet leadership principles. Something flickered in Morrison's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or professional interest. Miss Bennett, looking forward to your presentation. The topic sounds intriguing. Lance's confident smirk faltered slightly. You know her work, Colonel? Morrison's gaze remained steady on Sophia. I know quality leadership when I see it, regardless of volume level. Some of the most effective commanders I've served with were the ones who didn't need to shout to get results." As Morrison moved away, Lance's expression darkened. The colonel's subtle endorsement had undermined his attempt to publicly humiliate Sophia, and he clearly didn't appreciate the intervention. "Well," Lance said, his voice carrying a new edge, "I guess we'll all find out tomorrow just how effective quiet leadership really is. Should be ... educational." The menace in his tone was unmistakable, and Sophia realized that what had started as casual mockery was evolving into something more systematic. Lance Garrett had made her his target, and given his influence at the summit, tomorrow's presentation was going to be far more challenging than she'd anticipated. As the networking session continued, Sophia noticed how word of the encounter had spread. Conversations quieted when she approached groups, and she caught fragments of whispered discussions about the mouse, who thought she could teach lions how to roar. But Colonel Morrison's words echoed in her mind. Some of the most effective commanders I've served with were the ones who didn't need to shout to get results. If only they knew, she thought, touching the simple silver pendant she wore beneath her blazer, a piece of jewelry that bore no visible markings but carried more weight than any medal or ribbon she'd ever been awarded. Tomorrow she would stand before this audience and try to share lessons learned in the most high-stress environments imaginable. Whether they listened would depend on her ability to find her voice in a room full of people who'd already decided she didn't belong. As the evening wound down and participants began heading to their hotels, Sophia caught sight of Lance Garrett, deep in conversation with several other attendees near the exit. His animated gestures and their occasional glances in her direction made it clear that tomorrow's presentation would be about more than just sharing leadership insights. It would be about proving that strength didn't always announce itself with fanfare, and that sometimes the quietest voices carried the most important messages. The question was whether she'd have the courage to let them hear it. The next morning arrived with typical Seattle drizzle, casting a gray pallor over the conference center that seemed to match Sophia's mood. She'd spent most of the night rehearsing her presentation, not because she didn't know the material, she knew it better than anyone in that building, but because she was trying to find ways to make her soft voice carry the weight of her message without revealing more than she was ready to share. Sophia arrived early, hoping to set up her presentation materials and test the microphone system before the crowds arrived. The main auditorium was impressive, a 400-seat theater with tiered seating and professional lighting that made even the smallest speaker feel exposed under its glare. As she connected her laptop to the projection system, she became aware of voices in the hallway outside. Lance Garrett's distinctive baritone carried clearly through the partially open doors. "I'm telling you, this is going to be a disaster," he was saying to what sounded like a group of people. "I did some digging last night. This Sophia Bennett, there's almost nothing about her online. No major leadership positions, no published articles, no significant military decorations listed anywhere." Chad Williams' voice joined the conversation. "So how did she even get invited to speak?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Lance replied. "But I'll tell you what, someone made a serious mistake putting her on this program. Military leadership isn't about feelings and whispered encouragement. It's about decisive action, clear communication, and the ability to command respect under pressure." Another voice, one Sophia didn't recognize, chimed in. "Should be interesting to watch her try to project authority to an audience full of real leaders." "Oh, it'll be interesting." "All right," Lance said with obvious satisfaction. "I'm sitting front and center." Someone needs to ask the hard questions when her little presentation falls apart. Sophia felt her hands begin to tremble slightly as she finished setting up her slides. The presentation was scheduled for 10 a.m., which gave Lance and his growing circle of skeptics plenty of time to spread doubt throughout the audience. Dr. Rachel Turner appeared in the doorway, checking her watch with obvious concern. "Miss Bennett, We need to discuss a few things before your presentation. Sophia looked up from her laptop. Of course. Is there a problem? Dr. Turner stepped into the auditorium, closing the door behind her. Well, there have been some concerns raised about your presentation. Several attendees have questioned whether your background is sufficient for this audience. What kind of concerns? Questions about your qualifications, your experience level, whether you're the right fit for a military leadership summit. Dr. Turner's tone was diplomatic, but her message was clear. I want to give you an opportunity to withdraw gracefully. We could say you're feeling unwell, reschedule for a smaller venue. Sophia felt a familiar fire kindle in her chest. The same feeling she'd experienced when people told her she was too small, too quiet, too gentle for the military. Dr. Turner, I was invited to speak because someone believed I had valuable insights to share. I intend to honor that invitation, Dr. Turner sighed. Very well. But I have to warn you, this audience can be quite demanding if you're not prepared for challenging questions. I'll manage, Sophia said quietly as Dr. Turner left. Sophia noticed that the conversation in the hallway had grown louder and more. Participants had joined Lance's impromptu strategy session. Through the crack in the door, she could see at least 8 people gathered around him, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. The problem with these diversity initiatives, Lance was saying, his voice carrying clearly into the auditorium, is that they prioritize representation over qualification. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for including women in leadership discussions. But they should be women who've actually led something. A female voice responded. Sophia recognized it as belonging to Amanda Pierce, a retired Navy commander who specialized in logistics management. Lance, that seems a bit presumptuous. We don't know her background, don't we? Lance countered. Look at her yesterday. Barely spoke above a whisper, couldn't maintain eye contact. Looked like she was about to faint when I asked about her experience. These are not the qualities of someone who's commanded troops under fire, Chad Williams laughed. Maybe her big leadership experience was managing a filing cabinet at some rear echelon unit. The group's laughter felt like a physical blow, and Sophia found herself gripping the podium to steady herself. She'd faced enemy fire, made life-and-death decisions under impossible pressure, and saved lives that these people couldn't even imagine. But none of that mattered if she couldn't find a way to make her voice heard in this room. Colonel Morrison's voice suddenly cut through the hallway conversation. Gentlemen, ladies, perhaps we should save our assessments until after we've heard what Miss Bennett has to say. Of course, Colonel, Lance replied smoothly. I'm just concerned about the impression this gives to our international guests. Military leadership is about projecting strength and confidence. I'm not sure quiet leadership is what our allies need to see from American military professionals. Some of the strongest leaders I've known were the quiet ones, Morrison replied. They didn't need to announce their capabilities to every room they entered. Sophia felt a wave of gratitude toward the colonel, but she also realized that his defense was making Lance even more determined to prove his point. This was no longer about her presentation. It was about Lance's need to demonstrate his own importance by tearing her down publicly. At 9:45 a.m., attendees began filing into the auditorium. Sophia watched from the side stage as the seats filled with an impressive array of military professionals, defense contractors, and civilian experts. The front row, as Lance had promised, was occupied by him and his growing coalition of skeptics. Dr. Turner took the stage to provide Sophia's introduction, reading from a brief bio that mentioned her military service but provided few details. Please join me in welcoming Sophia Bennett, who will be speaking on quiet leadership in high-stress environments, lessons from forward operating bases. The applause was polite but notably restrained. Sophia walked to the podium, her heart pounding as she faced the sea of faces. The stage lights were brighter than she'd expected, making it difficult to see individual expressions. but she could feel the skepticism radiating from the audience. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone system despite her soft tone. "Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today." Lance immediately raised his hand. "Miss Bennett, before you begin, could you share some details about your military background? I think the audience would benefit from understanding your qualifications to speak on combat leadership." The interruption was clearly designed to throw her off balance, and Sophia felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied moments of high stress. But instead of panic, she felt something else, a calm determination that she'd learned to access in far more dangerous situations than this. "Mr. Garrett, I appreciate your question," she replied evenly. "I believe my experiences will become clear through the context of my presentation. If you have specific questions afterward, I'll be happy to address them." Lance's smile was predatory. "I'm just concerned that we're about to receive advice on combat leadership from someone who may never have been in combat. Surely that's relevant to your credibility?" The auditorium fell silent, and Sophia could feel 400 pairs of eyes focused on her. This was the moment Lance had been building toward, the public challenge designed to expose her as an imposter. She touched the silver pendant beneath her blazer, feeling its familiar weight, and made a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Garrett," she said, her quiet voice somehow carrying more authority than it had all weekend, "you're absolutely right that credibility matters in discussions of combat leadership. And you're right that the audience deserves to know my background." She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "I think the best way to establish that credibility is through the lessons I've learned, rather than the titles I've held. Shall we begin?" Lance's confident expression flickered slightly. He'd expected her to fold under pressure, to admit inadequacy or flee the stage. Her calm response had deflected his attack while maintaining her dignity, a move that suggested there might be more to Sophia Bennett than anyone had assumed. As she began her presentation, showing the first slide with an image of a remote mountain outpost, Sophia felt the familiar calm descending. This was her element, not the politics and posturing, but the real work of leadership under pressure. The audience was about to learn that quiet voices sometimes carried the loudest truths. Question was whether Lance Garrett was prepared for what he was about to hear. Sophia's first slide displayed a stark photograph of a remote forward operating base nestled in mountainous terrain. The image was clearly taken from an aircraft, showing the isolated outpost surrounded by hostile territory with no visible roads or supply lines. "Leadership in high-stress environments," she began, her voice steady despite the hostile energy radiating from the front row, "isn't always about the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's about the voice that can be heard over the sound of incoming mortar, or the one that can guide an aircraft through zero visibility conditions when lives hang in the balance." Lance Garrett shifted in his seat, clearly preparing. Another interruption, but Colonel Morrison caught his eye with a look that suggested he should let the presentation proceed. "The misconception that many people have," Sophia continued, advancing to her next slide, "is that military leadership is primarily about projection of authority through volume and aggression. While these qualities certainly have their place, they can also be liabilities in situations that require precision, calm decision-making, and the ability to process complex information under extreme pressure." Her second slide showed a communication flowchart, the kind used in coordinating multiple aircraft, ground units, and command elements during complex operations. The diagram was clearly military in origin, with call signs and frequencies that only someone with operational experience would understand. Consider a situation where you're coordinating between multiple assets in a contested environment, Sophia explained, her confidence growing as she moved into familiar territory. You have fast-moving aircraft overhead, ground units in contact, and time-sensitive intelligence coming through multiple channels. The leader who can process this information calmly and communicate clearly regardless of their vocal volume is the one who saves lives. Amanda Pierce, the retired Navy commander, leaned forward with obvious interest. This wasn't the amateur presentation she'd been led to expect. The terminology Sophia was using, the operational details she referenced, these suggested real experience. Lance, however, was growing more agitated. "Miss Bennett," he interrupted again, "these scenarios sound very theoretical. Can you give us a specific example from your own experience?" Sophia paused, her hand unconsciously moving to the pendant beneath her blazer. This was the question she'd been dreading, the one that would force her to choose between maintaining her privacy and proving her credibility. "Mr. Garrett," she replied carefully, "I think the principles I'm discussing are more important than any individual anecdotes. The goal is to understand how quiet leadership can be effective, not to focus on specific personal experiences." Lance's smile was triumphant. "So you don't have specific experiences to share. You're speaking theoretically about situations you've never actually faced." The auditorium buzzed with whispered conversations. Several attendees were clearly questioning whether they were wasting their time listening to someone without real combat experience. Chad Williams, emboldened by Lance's success, raised his hand. "If you can't give us real examples, how do we know these principles actually work in practice?" Sophia felt the walls closing in. She could continue to deflect, but doing so would only reinforce their perception that she was unqualified. Or she could share experiences that she'd never spoken about publicly, experiences that were still classified in many respects. "Let me put this in context," she said, her voice becoming firmer. "The reason I focus on principles rather than personal anecdotes is that specific operational details often remain classified. But you're right that principles without practice are merely academic theories." She advanced to the next slide, which showed a map of Afghanistan with several locations marked. "The principles I'm discussing were developed during multiple deployments in support of Special Operations Forces, in environments where the margin for error was measured in seconds, and where the wrong decision didn't just mean mission failure, it meant American soldiers not coming home." The room fell noticeably quieter. The map on the screen was clearly not something pulled from a public source. It showed operational details that only someone with access to classified information would possess. Colonel Morrison sat up straighter, his experienced eye recognizing the authenticity of what he was seeing. This wasn't theoretical knowledge, this was operational intelligence from someone who'd been there. "In these environments," Sophia continued, "the most effective leaders weren't necessarily the ones who could shout orders over gunfire. They were the ones who could remain calm when everything was falling apart, who could process multiple information streams simultaneously, and who could communicate critical information clearly under extreme stress." Lance's confidence was beginning to waver, but he pressed on. "Anyone can show pictures and talk about deployments. What specific role did you play in these operations?" It was the question Sophia had hoped to avoid, but she realized that continuing to dodge it would undermine everything she was trying to accomplish. The audience deserved to know they were listening to someone with real experience, even if sharing that experience meant revealing more about herself than she was comfortable with. "My role," she said quietly, "was to ensure that aircraft and ground units could communicate effectively in contested environments, to provide real-time intelligence and coordination that kept operations running smoothly even when original plans fell apart." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a simplified diagram of air-ground coordination procedures. "When you're managing multiple aircraft stacks, coordinating with ground units under fire, and processing intelligence updates in real time, the ability to remain calm and communicate clearly becomes a matter of life and death." Dr. Rachel Turner, who had been watching from the side of the auditorium, found herself genuinely intrigued for the first time. The level of technical detail Sophia was presenting suggested far more experience than her initial impression had. indicated. The point I'm trying to make, Sophia continued, is that effective leadership in high-stress situations isn't about commanding through intimidation or volume. It's about building trust, maintaining clarity under pressure, and ensuring that critical information flows efficiently through complex systems. Lance wasn't giving up. But surely in combat situations, you need leaders who can take charge, who can be decisive and aggressive when necessary. Absolutely, Sophia agreed. But aggression without precision is just chaos. The most effective combat leaders I've worked with were those who could scale their response, appropriately aggressive when the situation called for it, but calm and methodical when precision was required. She advanced to a slide showing communication protocols for close air support operations. When you're coordinating between pilots flying at 300 miles per hour and ground units under fire, the leader who saves lives is the one who can communicate clearly and accurately, not the one who shouts the loudest. The technical details on the slide were clearly authentic frequency allocations, procedural call signs, and coordination methods that only someone with operational experience would know. Several military attendees in the audience were now looking at Sophia with new interest. Of Colonel Morrison was studying her presentation materials with growing recognition. Something about the operational details she was sharing, the specific procedures she referenced, was triggering memories of briefings he'd attended about highly classified operations. "Ms. Bennett," he said, raising his hand for the first time, "the coordination procedures you're describing, these seem quite specialized." "What type of units did you work with?" Sophia hesitated. Colonel Morrison's question was getting dangerously close to information she couldn't share publicly. But his tone suggested professional interest rather than skepticism, and she realized he might be starting to piece together who she really was. "I worked primarily with Special Operations Forces," she replied carefully. "Units that required extremely precise coordination between air and ground elements." The room was completely silent now. Even Lance seemed to sense that the dynamic was shifting, though he wasn't sure why. "And your role in these operations?" Morrison pressed gently. Sophia met his eyes, seeing recognition beginning to dawn there. "I was responsible for ensuring that communication between all elements remained clear and effective, regardless of the tactical situation." It was the most she could say without revealing classified information, but Colonel Morrison's expression suggested it was enough. He was beginning to understand exactly who Sophia Bennett was, and why her quiet voice had once commanded the attention of generals. The question was whether she was ready to let the rest of the room discover the same truth. The shift in the room's energy was subtle but unmistakable. What had begun as a skeptical audience waiting for an amateur to fail was gradually transforming into a group of professionals recognizing expertise they hadn't expected. But Lance Garrett wasn't ready to concede defeat. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice taking on a more aggressive edge, "you keep talking about special operations and classified details, but anyone can claim to have worked with elite units. What proof do you have that you actually participated in these operations rather than just reading about them in briefings?" Sophia felt her jaw tighten. Lance was essentially calling her a liar in front of 400 military professionals, a challenge that went beyond professional skepticism into personal attack territory. "Mr. Garrett," she replied, her voice remaining calm despite the provocation, "I'm not here to prove my credentials to you. I'm here to share insights about effective leadership principles that can benefit everyone in this room." "But credentials matter," Lance pressed, standing up from his front row seat for emphasis. "If we're going to take advice about combat leadership, we need to know it comes from someone who's actually led in combat, not someone who filed paperwork at a forward operating base." The insult was clear and deliberate. Lance was suggesting that Sophia's role had been administrative rather than operational, a particularly stinging accusation for someone whose actual responsibilities had been far more critical than anyone. in the room could imagine. Chad Williams sensed his mentor's momentum and jumped in. Yeah, there's a big difference between being stationed at an FOB and actually being involved in combat operations. Which were you? Sophia found herself at a crossroads. She could continue to deflect and maintain her privacy, but doing so would allow Lance to control the narrative and undermine her credibility with the entire audience. Or she could reveal enough of the truth to establish her qualifications, even if it meant sharing information she'd never intended to make public. Dr. Rachel Turner, watching from the side of the auditorium, was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the hostile tone the Q&A session was taking. This wasn't professional skepticism, it was personal attack, and it was making the entire summit look unprofessional. Perhaps, Dr. Turner interjected, we could allow Ms. Bennett to complete her presentation before. No, it's all right, Sophia said, raising her hand gently. Mr. Garrett raises valid questions about the source of expertise in leadership discussions. I think the audience deserves transparency. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of a remote mountainous region marked with operational overlays. The image was clearly taken from military surveillance equipment with tactical markings and grid coordinates visible. The operations I'm referring to took place primarily in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. She began, her voice taking on a different quality, more authoritative, more precise. The region you see here was considered one of the most challenging operational environments in the theater, with limited visibility, complex terrain, and frequent enemy contact. Colonel Morrison leaned forward, his attention now completely focused. The photograph on the screen was familiar. He'd seen similar images in classified briefings about operations in that exact region. My role in these operations, Sophia continued, was to serve as the primary communication link between ground units and close air support assets. When special operations teams were inserted into contested areas, I was responsible for ensuring they maintained contact with overhead aircraft and could call for support when needed. Lance scoffed. So you were a radio operator? That's hardly combat leadership. Sophia's eyes flashed with something that hadn't been there before, a hardness that spoke of experiences far beyond anything Lance Garrett had ever faced. Mr. Garrett, she said, her quiet voice somehow carrying more menace than his loud bluster. When a 12-man special forces team is pinned down by enemy fire in a valley with no escape routes, and the only thing standing between them and death is clear communication with aircraft overhead, that radio operator becomes the most important person in their world. The room fell completely silent. Even Lance seemed to sense that he'd pushed into territory he didn't understand. When visibility is zero, when GPS signals are being jammed, when the original landing zone has been compromised, and you have 30 seconds to guide pilots to an alternate extraction point while taking enemy fire in those moments, the person on the radio isn't just an operator. They're the lifeline that brings those soldiers home. Sophia advanced to the next slide, showing a tactical communication diagram with multiple aircraft and ground unit positions. The reason I focus on quiet leadership principles is that in these situations, the person who saves lives isn't the one shouting orders. It's the one who can remain calm under extreme pressure, process multiple information streams simultaneously, and communicate critical information clearly when seconds matter. Amanda Pierce was now studying Sophia with intense interest. The operational details she was describing weren't theoretical, they were specific, technical, and spoken with the kind of authority that only came from direct experience. But surely, Lance said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, actual combat leaders would have more comprehensive experience than communication support. Sophia looked at him for a long moment, and Colonel Morrison saw something in her expression that made him sit up straighter. He was beginning to suspect that Sophia Bennett's role in those operations had been far more significant than she was revealing. Mr. Garrett, Sophia said quietly, What do you think happens when the communication link between ground units and air support goes down during an active firefight? Lance shrugged. They lose radio contact. They die, Sophia replied. Flatly, when special operations teams lose communication with overhead aircraft, they lose their lifeline. The person responsible for maintaining that communication isn't just support personnel. They're often the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She clicked to the next slide, showing a timeline of a complex operation with multiple phases and coordination points. The operations I supported required split-second timing between ground movements and airstrikes. The margin for error was measured in seconds, and the consequences of mistakes were measured in American lives. Dr. Turner found herself genuinely impressed for the first time. Whatever Sophia's specific role had been, she clearly had extensive experience in high-stakes military operations. The leadership principles I'm discussing, Sophia continued, were developed in an environment where hesitation meant death, where unclear communication could result in friendly fire incidents, and where the ability to remain calm under extreme stress was literally a matter of life and death. Colonel Morrison was now studying Sophia with intense recognition. Something about her description of communication procedures, the specific operational details she referenced, was triggering memories of classified briefings he'd attended years ago about a particular series of operations in eastern Afghanistan. Operations that had involved a female communications specialist whose call sign had become legendary among special operations forces. A specialist whose precision and calm under fire had saved more American lives than most people would ever know. Lance, sensing that the momentum was shifting away from him, made one final attempt to regain control. Look, Ms. Bennett, I'm sure you had an important support role, but let's be honest about what we're discussing here. Real combat leadership requires— Mr. Garrett, Colonel Morrison interrupted, his voice cutting through the auditorium with unmistakable authority. I think you should be very careful about making assumptions regarding Ms. Bennett's qualifications. Lance turned to face the colonel, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Colonel, with all due respect, I think the audience deserves to know exactly what kind of experience we're being asked to learn from. Morrison's expression was stone-cold serious. Mr. Garrett, I think you're about to get exactly what you're asking for. He turned to look at Sophia, and she saw in his eyes that he'd figured out who she was. The question that remained was whether she was ready to let everyone else know the truth about the quiet woman they'd been dismissing all weekend. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The tension in the auditorium was palpable. 400 people sat in complete silence, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, but not quite understanding what. Lance Garrett stood in the front row, his face flushed with the confidence of someone who believed he was about to expose a fraud. Colonel Morrison sat rigid in his seat, his weathered face grave with the knowledge of what was about to unfold. And at the podium, Sophia Bennett stood quietly, her hand unconsciously touching the silver pendant beneath her blazer as she made the most difficult decision of her civilian life. Mr. Garrett, she said, her voice carrying a new quality that made even the most skeptical audience members lean forward. You've been very insistent about understanding my qualifications. You've questioned my experience, my credentials, and my right to speak about combat leadership. Lance's smile was triumphant. I'm just asking for transparency. This audience deserves to know whether they're learning from someone with real experience or just another shadow strike. The two words fell into the auditorium like a bomb detonating in slow motion. Sophia had spoken them quietly, almost conversationally, but their effect was immediate and devastating. Colonel Morrison's face went completely white. His hand instinctively moved to attention position before he caught himself. Around the auditorium, the handful of special operations veterans present began to sit up straighter. their expressions shifting from curiosity to something approaching awe. Lance, however, looked confused. "Shadow what? What are you talking about?" But Amanda Pierce, the retired Navy commander, was staring at Sophia with sudden recognition. She'd heard that call sign before, in classified briefings about operations that had gone so far beyond successful that they'd become legend within special operations circles. "Shadow strike," Sophia repeated, her voice growing stronger. "That was my call sign during Operation Iron Rain and 17 other classified missions in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan." Dr. Rachel Turner, still standing at the side of the auditorium, felt her knees go weak. She'd heard that call sign mentioned in military circles, always in hushed, reverent tones, always accompanied by stories that seemed too incredible to be true. "For those of you who don't recognize the designation," Sophia continued, her quiet voice somehow filling the entire auditorium, "Shadow Strike was the call sign assigned to the primary tactical air controller for a series of deep reconnaissance and direct action missions conducted by Task Force 121 between 2018 and 2020. Lance was still looking around in confusion, but several military attendees were now staring at Sophia with expressions of disbelief mixed with respect. Task Force 121 was a name that appeared only in the most classified briefings, associated with operations that officially didn't exist. Colonel Morrison slowly stood up, his movement drawing every eye in the auditorium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "Shadow Strike was the call sign of the tactical air controller who coordinated close air support for some of the most dangerous special operations missions of the entire Afghanistan conflict." Sophia felt her chest tighten. She'd never wanted this moment, never wanted the attention or the recognition. But Lance's relentless attacks had forced her hand, and now there was no turning back. "The operations Colonel Morrison is referring to," she said, advancing to a new slide that showed a map marked with locations she'd never intended to reveal publicly, involved small special forces teams inserted deep into enemy territory to conduct high-value target elimination and intelligence-gathering missions. The slide displayed a tactical overview of Operation Iron Rain, the mission that had made her call sign legendary within special operations circles. Even the unclassified version of the map showed the incredible complexity of coordinating multiple aircraft, ground units, and intelligence assets across hostile terrain. "My role," Sophia continued, her voice growing steadier with each word, "was to serve as the link between these ground teams and all supporting aircraft. When teams were inserted into areas with no communication infrastructure, no GPS reliability, and constant enemy activity, I was their lifeline to air support, medical evacuation, and extraction." Lance was beginning to understand that something significant was happening, but he wasn't ready to back down. Anyone can claim to have had an important military job. "What proof, Mr. Garrett?" Colonel Morrison interrupted, his voice cutting through the auditorium like a blade. "I suggest you stop talking immediately." The colonel's tone carried 30 years of command authority, and even Lance recognized that he was in dangerous territory. But his ego wouldn't let him retreat completely. "I'm just asking for verification," Lance said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. General Lisa Cooper chose that moment to enter the auditorium. She'd been delayed by morning briefings at Joint Base Lewis McChord, but had arrived just in time to hear Sophia reveal her call sign. The effect of her entrance was immediate. Everyone who recognized her 3-star rank snapped to attention. "Verification?" General Cooper said, her voice carrying clearly as she walked down the center aisle toward the stage. "Mr. Garrett, let me provide you with some verification." She stopped directly in front of Lance's row, her presence commanding absolute attention. Shadow Strike was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Bronze Star with V device for valor, and a classified commendation that I'm not authorized to discuss in this forum. Her actions during Operation Iron Rain alone saved the lives of 43 American Special Operations personnel. The auditorium was so quiet that the air conditioning system seemed thunderously loud. General Cooper's words hung in the air like physical objects, impossible to ignore or dismiss. But more importantly, the general continued, turning to face Sophia at the podium. Shadow Strike was the tactical air controller who talked Alpha Team through the extraction at Firebase Delta when their radios were jammed. Their GPS was compromised, and enemy forces had them surrounded. Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, remembering that night, the longest 6 hours of her military career, spent guiding helicopters through zero visibility conditions while coordinating with ground units. Under heavy fire, she guided those aircraft through a sandstorm, using only voice navigation and her knowledge of the terrain, while taking enemy fire and coordinating with multiple ground units simultaneously, General Cooper said. The pilots later said it was like having an angel guiding them through hell. Lance Garrett sank back into his seat, the color draining from his face as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. He'd spent 2 days mocking and attacking one of the most decorated air controllers in recent military history. Chad Williams, his young protege, looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. The woman they'd dismissed as a quiet mouse had been instrumental in some of the most dangerous and successful special operations missions of the entire Afghanistan conflict. So when Ms. Bennett speaks about quiet leadership under pressure, General Cooper concluded, perhaps you should listen, because she's practiced those principles in situations where failure meant American soldiers died, and success meant heroes came home to their families. Sophia stood at the podium, feeling exposed and vulnerable, but also strangely liberated. The secret she'd carried for years was finally out, and the room full of people who'd questioned her credentials now understood exactly who they'd been talking to. The question was what would happen next, now that everyone knew that the quiet woman at the podium was Shadow Strike, the legend whose voice had once guided warriors through the darkness and brought them safely home. The silence that followed General Cooper's revelation was unlike anything the Pacific Northwest Conference Hall had ever experienced. 400 military professionals, defense contractors, and leadership experts sat in stunned quiet, processing the fact that they'd just witnessed one of the most decorated tactical air controllers in modern military history being publicly attacked by a man whose greatest achievement was selling training programs to weekend warriors. Sophia stood at the podium, feeling simultaneously exposed and empowered. The secret she'd guarded so carefully was now public knowledge, but the weight of carrying it alone was finally lifted from her shoulders. General Cooper remained standing in the center aisle, her 3-star rank commanding absolute attention, even in civilian clothes. Ms. Bennett, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, please continue with your presentation. I believe this audience is now properly prepared to receive your insights on leadership under pressure. Lance Garrett sat frozen in his front row seat, his face cycling through shades of pale as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. For 2 days, he'd been systematically attacking and humiliating a woman whose military record made his own civilian achievements look like high school participation trophies. Chad Williams, his young protege, had sunk so low in his seat that he was practically hiding behind the chair in front of him. The arrogant confidence that had sustained his attacks on Sophia had evaporated completely, replaced by the horrifying realization that he'd been mocking a genuine war hero. Thank you, General Cooper, Sophia said, her voice carrying new authority that hadn't been there before the revelation. I'd like to continue by discussing how the principles of tactical air control translate to civilian leadership challenges. She advanced to the next slide, which showed a complex coordination diagram involving multiple aircraft types, ground units, and command elements. When you're managing a close air support mission, you're essentially serving as the central nervous system for a complex operation. involving dozens of people whose lives depend on your ability to process information and communicate clearly. The technical details on the screen were no longer mysterious. They were the tools of someone who'd used them to save lives in the most dangerous environments on Earth. Every call sign, every frequency designation, every coordination procedure represented real experience earned under fire. Amanda Pierce raised her hand, her earlier skepticism completely replaced by professional respect. Ms. Bennett, or should I say Shadow Strike, can you walk us through how you maintain situational awareness when coordinating multiple aircraft in contested airspace? Sophia felt a wave of relief at the respectful tone of the question. The key is building what we call a mental picture of the battle space. You have to track multiple moving elements simultaneously: friendly ground forces, enemy positions, aircraft, locations, and constantly changing tactical situations. She clicked to a new slide showing the three-dimensional tactical display. In civilian leadership terms, this translates to the ability to manage multiple projects, stakeholder groups, and priorities simultaneously while maintaining awareness of how changes in one area affect everything else. Colonel Morrison, who had been watching the transformation in the room's dynamics, raised his hand. Shadow Strike, during Operation Iron Rain, you coordinated air support for 3 separate special operations teams across a 50-kilometer area for over 18 hours. Can you describe the leadership challenges of that mission? Sophia paused, weighing how much operational detail she could share publicly. The challenge wasn't just the technical complexity, Colonel. It was managing the human element, keeping pilots focused during extended operations, maintaining team morale when missions extended far beyond planned timelines, and making life-or-death decisions when information was incomplete or contradictory. She advanced to the next slide, showing a timeline of the operation with coordination points marked. There were moments during that mission when I had to choose between following established procedures and making judgment calls based on real-time conditions. The pilots and ground teams had to trust that my decisions were sound, even when they couldn't see the full tactical picture. Dr. Rachel Turner, still standing at the side of the auditorium, found herself taking notes for the first time during the conference. This wasn't just military history. These were leadership principles that applied to any high-stakes environment. The lesson for civilian leaders, Sophia continued, is that authority isn't just about position or title. It's about demonstrating competence consistently, especially when the stakes are highest and the pressure is most intense. An Air Force colonel in the third row raised his hand. Shadow Strike, how did you handle communication when radio systems were compromised or jammed? Redundancy and adaptability, Sophia replied immediately. We always had backup communication methods, but more importantly, we established clear protocols that everyone understood. When primary systems failed, teams knew exactly how to switch to alternate procedures without losing coordination. She clicked to a slide showing multiple communication pathways. In civilian terms, this means building organizational systems that can function even when key personnel are unavailable or when primary processes break down. It's about creating resilience through preparation and cross-training. The questions kept coming, each one more technical and respectful than the last. The transformation in the room was complete. Sophia had gone from being dismissed as an unqualified speaker to being recognized as a subject matter expert whose insights were invaluable. Lance Garrett remained silent, apparently trying to make himself invisible. The aggressive confidence that had carried him through 2 days of attacks had been completely shattered by the revelation of who he'd been targeting. General Cooper, still standing in the center aisle, raised her hand. Shadow Strike, can you discuss how you maintained performance under extreme stress, particularly during extended operations when fatigue became a factor? Sophia nodded, clicking to a slide showing stress management techniques adapted from military training. The key is understanding that stress is information. It tells you that something important is happening and that your performance matters. The goal isn't to eliminate stress, but to channel it effectively. During extended operations, we used what's called controlled breathing techniques to maintain focus, regular communication checks to ensure team coordination, and systematic rotation of responsibilities to prevent individual burnout. She looked directly at Lance for the first time since revealing her call sign. The mistake many people make is thinking that leadership under pressure requires dramatic gestures or loud commands. In reality, the most effective leaders in high-stress situations are often the ones who appear calmest, because their teams draw confidence from that stability. The implied criticism was subtle but unmistakable. Lance's aggressive style, which he presented as evidence of strong leadership, was actually the opposite of what worked in truly high-stakes situations. Quiet leadership, Sophia continued, isn't about being passive or indecisive. It's about having the confidence to remain calm when everyone around you is losing control, and the competence to make critical decisions without needing to announce your authority to the room. The applause that followed was thunderous, not the polite acknowledgement she'd received earlier, but the genuine appreciation of professionals who recognized they were learning from someone who'd proven these principles in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. As the formal presentation portion ended and the session moved to open discussion, Sophia noticed that Lance Garrett was quietly gathering his materials and heading for the exit. His retreat was as silent as his attacks had been loud, the behavior of someone who'd finally understood that he'd picked a fight with someone completely out of his league. The legend of Shadow Strike was no longer a secret, and everyone in the room now understood that sometimes the quietest voices carried the most important truths. As the formal presentation concluded and participants began filing out for the lunch break, the dynamics in the Pacific Northwest Conference Hall had shifted completely. Small groups formed around Sophia, with military professionals and defense contractors eager to introduce themselves to the woman they now knew as Shadow Strike. Colonel Morrison was among the first to approach the podium. "Ma'am," he said, extending his hand with obvious respect, "I had the privilege of reading the classified after-action reports from Operation Iron Rain. What you accomplished that night was nothing short of miraculous." Sophia shook his hand, still adjusting to the public recognition she'd spent years avoiding. "Thank you, Colonel. I was just doing my job." "No, ma'am," Morrison replied firmly. "What you did went far beyond duty. Those 43 Special Operations personnel owe their lives to your ability to coordinate air support under impossible conditions." Amanda Pierce joined the conversation, her earlier skepticism completely replaced by professional admiration. "Shadow Strike, I have to apologize for my initial reaction. When Lance was attacking your credentials, I should have spoken up instead of waiting to see what would happen." "There's nothing to apologize for," Sophia replied. Without context, his questions were reasonable. Military leadership discussions should include verification of experience. General Cooper, who had remained in the auditorium to observe the post-presentation discussions, approached with a serious expression. "Miss Bennett, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They moved to a quiet corner of the auditorium, away from the growing crowd of admirers and well-wishers. "Shadow Strike," General Cooper said quietly, "I need to address what happened here today. Mr. Garrett's behavior was completely inappropriate, and I want to make sure there are consequences for his actions." Sophia felt a familiar discomfort with being the center of attention. "General, I appreciate your concern, but I'd prefer to just move forward. The truth is out now, and that's enough." "With respect, ma'am, it's not enough," Cooper replied firmly. "What Garrett did constitutes harassment of a decorated veteran, and it was done in front of an audience of military professionals. This can't be allowed to stand without consequences." As they talked, Lance Garrett was discovering that his problems were just beginning. Word of the Shadow Strike revelation had spread quickly through the conference, and several of his major clients were already requesting emergency meetings. Dr. Rachel Turner found Lance in the hotel lobby, frantically making phone calls to his business partners. His confident swagger had been replaced by the desperate energy of someone whose professional reputation was crumbling in real time. "Mr. Garrett," Dr. Turner said, approaching with the kind of formal politeness that preceded. "Bad news. We need to discuss your participation in the remainder of the conference." Lance looked up from his phone, his face pale and drawn. "Dr. Turner, I can explain." "Actually, you can't," she interrupted. "What happened in that auditorium was witnessed by over 400 military professionals, including several general officers. Your behavior was completely unacceptable, and it's reflecting poorly on the entire conference." Lance's phone buzzed with another incoming call, the third major client to contact him in the past hour. "Look, I made a mistake. I didn't know who she was." "If I had known, that's exactly the problem, Mr. Garrett," Dr. Turner said coldly. "Your behavior wasn't based on not knowing her credentials. It was based on your assumption that a quiet woman couldn't possibly have significant military experience. That kind of prejudice has no place at a professional military conference." Meanwhile, back in the auditorium, Sophia found herself surrounded by a growing crowd of attendees who wanted to hear more about her experiences. The questions were technical, respectful, and focused on learning rather than challenging her credibility. "Shadow strike," asked a retired Air Force colonel, "during extended operations, how did you manage the cognitive load of tracking multiple aircraft while coordinating with ground units under fire?" Sophia clicked to a new slide she'd prepared for exactly this type of technical discussion. "The key is building what we call a mental stack, a systematic way of prioritizing information flow based on immediate threat assessment and mission criticality." She explained the technique she'd developed for maintaining situational awareness during complex operations, drawing parallels to civilian leadership challenges that required managing multiple priorities under pressure. Chad Williams, Lance's young protege, had spent the lunch break in his hotel room, frantically updating his LinkedIn profile and trying to distance himself from his mentor's increasingly toxic reputation. The confident young man who joined Lance's attacks on Sophia now understood that he'd been complicit in harassing a genuine war hero. His phone rang. It was his supervisor at the defense contracting firm where he worked as a junior associate. "Williams," came the stern voice of his boss, "I just got calls from 3 different clients asking about your behavior at the Seattle conference. What the hell happened out there?" Chad tried to explain, but the more he talked, the worse it sounded. He'd been caught on camera laughing at jokes about a decorated veteran's service record, joining in attacks on someone whose military achievements dwarfed his own non-existent combat experience. Back at the conference, word was spreading through social media about the revelation. Military forums were buzzing with discussions about Shadow Strike's legendary status among Special Operations Forces, and several major defense publications were already requesting interviews. General Cooper found Sophia during the afternoon break, approaching with a proposal that would change everything. "Shadow Strike," she said, "I've been thinking about what happened today, and I believe there's an opportunity here that goes beyond just correcting Mr. Garrett's behavior." Sophia looked up from reviewing her presentation notes. "What kind of opportunity, General?" "The military has a serious problem with harassment and discrimination, particularly targeting female veterans. What you demonstrated today, standing up to systematic attacks and proving your worth through competence rather than confrontation, that's a masterclass in professional leadership." Cooper paused, studying Sophia's reaction. "I'd like to offer you a position developing training programs for veteran transition services. Specifically, programs that help female veterans deal with the kind of discrimination you face today." "I appreciate the offer, General, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of public attention." "Ma'am, with respect, you don't have a choice anymore," Cooper replied gently. "Word about Shadow Strike is already spreading through military communities. You can either let others control the narrative about who you are and what you represent, or you can take charge of that story yourself. Meanwhile, Lance Garrett was learning the cost of his arrogance. 2 major clients had already terminated their contracts, citing concerns about his judgment and professionalism. A third was demanding a full refund for training programs they'd purchased, stating that they couldn't work with someone who'd publicly attacked a decorated veteran. His phone rang again. This time, it was a reporter from Military Times who'd heard about the incident and wanted his comment for a story they were preparing about harassment at military conferences. "Mr. Garrett," the reporter said, "I'm writing a story about today's incident at the Northwest Military Leadership Council Conference. Would you like to comment on your confrontation with the tactical air controller known as Shadow Strike?" Lance felt his stomach drop. The story was going national, which meant his reputation would be destroyed far beyond the Seattle conference. "Circuit." "No comment," he managed, hanging up the phone. As the day continued, it became clear that the revelation of Shadow Strike's identity had consequences far beyond a single conference presentation. Sophia Bennett had been forced out of the shadows, and the military community was about to discover that their quiet hero was ready to find her voice in an entirely new way. The question was whether she was prepared for the responsibilities that came with being a symbol of quiet strength in a world that often mistook volume for authority. The conference's final day arrived with an unexpected twist. Lance Garrett, who should have quietly departed after his humiliation, had instead doubled down on his destructive course. Rather than accepting defeat and trying to salvage what remained of his reputation, he'd spent the night crafting one last desperate gambit to destroy Sophia's credibility. Sophia discovered his plan when she arrived at the conference center to find a small crowd gathered around the registration desk, reading printed flyers that Lance had apparently distributed during the early morning hours. "What's this about?" she asked Dr. Rachel Turner, who was holding one of the flyers with obvious disgust. "Mr. Garrett has been circulating these since 6 a.m., Turner replied, handing Sophia the paper. "He's claiming that your presentation yesterday contained classified information that you weren't authorized to share publicly." Sophia read the flyer with growing anger. Lance had twisted her operational references into allegations that she'd violated security protocols by discussing classified missions in an open forum. The document was carefully worded to sound like a concerned citizen reporting potential security violations rather than the vindictive attack it actually was. "He's already contacted the FBI field office and the Defense Security Service," Turner continued. "He's claiming that Shadow Strike may have compromised ongoing operations by revealing tactical procedures and operational details. The accusation was particularly insidious because it contained just enough technical terminology to sound credible to non-military personnel, while being completely baseless to anyone who understood classification protocols." General Cooper appeared at Sophia's side, her expression darker than a thunderstorm. "Ms. Bennett, I've been briefed on Mr. Garrett's latest accusations. I want you to know that the Defense Security Service has already reviewed the recording of your presentation and found no violations of classification protocols. But the damage is already done," Sophia replied quietly. "Even if the investigation clears me, the mere existence of these allegations will follow me forever." "Not if we handle this correctly," Cooper said firmly. "Mr. Garrett has made a serious mistake. Filing false reports about security violations is itself a federal crime, and he's done it in writing with witnesses." As word of Lance's accusations spread through the conference, the reaction was swift and decisive. Military professionals who had witnessed Sophia's presentation understood immediately that Lance's allegations were false. She had been careful to discuss only general principles and unclassified operational concepts. Colonel Morrison approached with a group of senior officers, all wearing expressions of barely controlled fury. "Shadow Strike," he said. "We've been discussing Mr. Garrett's actions. And we want you to know that we're prepared to provide sworn statements supporting your conduct during yesterday's presentation. More importantly, added Amanda Pierce, we're prepared to file formal complaints about Mr. Garrett's harassment campaign. What he's doing now goes beyond professional disagreement. It's malicious persecution of a decorated veteran. The confrontation came to a head during the conference's closing ceremony. Lance, apparently believing that his accusations would force Sophia to withdraw quietly, had positioned himself prominently in the front row, ready to capitalize on what he expected would be her disgrace. Instead, he found himself facing a united front of military professionals who had rallied around Shadow Strike. Dr. Turner took the podium for the closing remarks, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. Before we conclude this year's conference, I need to address a serious matter that has come to our attention. She gestured toward Lance, who was beginning to look uncomfortable as he realized the room's energy had turned hostile toward him rather than Sophia. This morning, we received allegations from a conference participant claiming that yesterday's presentation by Miss Sophia Bennett contained unauthorized disclosure of classified information. These allegations have been thoroughly investigated by appropriate authorities. Turner paused, letting the tension build. I'm pleased to report that the Defense Security Service has found these allegations to be completely without merit. Ms. Bennett's presentation contained no classified information and violated no security protocols. The relief in the room was palpable, but Turner wasn't finished. However, the investigation did reveal that the person making these false allegations, Mr. Lance Garrett, appears to have filed deliberately misleading reports with federal agencies in what can only be described as a malicious attempt to damage a decorated veteran's reputation. Lance's face went white as he realized that his final gambit had not only failed, but had exposed him to potential criminal liability for filing false reports. Therefore, Turner continued, the Northwest Military Leadership Council is permanently banning Mr. Garrett from all future events, and we will be sharing our findings with other professional organizations to ensure that this type of harassment doesn't continue elsewhere. The applause that followed was thunderous, but it wasn't celebration. It was the sound of a professional community rejecting someone who had violated its most fundamental values. General Cooper took the podium next, her 3-star rank commanding absolute attention. I'd like to add something to Dr. Turner's remarks, she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades of military service. Yesterday we witnessed something extraordinary. We saw a decorated veteran subjected to systematic harassment and false accusations, and we saw how she responded not with anger or retaliation, but with dignity, professionalism, and quiet strength. She looked directly at Sophia, who was sitting in the third row, still processing the rapid turn of events. Shadow Strike represents the best of American military values. She served with distinction in the most dangerous environments our nation has faced, and she's continued to serve by sharing her expertise with others. The fact that some people chose to attack her rather than learn from her says everything about their character and nothing about hers. Cooper's voice grew stronger as she continued. But what happened here also represents something larger, a teachable moment about the difference between real leadership and the kind of toxic behavior that undermines military professionalism. She gestured toward the space where Lance had been sitting. He had quietly slipped out during her remarks, apparently unwilling to face the consequences of his actions. Real leaders don't need to tear others down to build themselves up. They don't attack people based on assumptions about gender, voice, or demeanor. They evaluate others based on competence, character, and contribution. The general paused, scanning the audience. Shadow Strike embodies those qualities, and I'm proud to announce that she has accepted a position with the Department of Veterans Affairs, developing programs to help female veterans transition successfully to civilian careers. Sophia felt her breath catch. She had agreed to consider Cooper's offer, but hadn't expected it to be announced publicly. The general's smile suggested. This was a deliberate move, making it official in front of 400 witnesses to ensure there was no backing out. These programs will focus on helping veterans recognize and articulate their value in civilian contexts, dealing with discrimination and harassment, and finding their voice in professional environments that may not immediately recognize their worth. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes. Sophia stood reluctantly, still uncomfortable with public attention, but beginning to understand that her story had become larger than her personal preferences. As the conference concluded and participants began departing, Sophia found herself surrounded by people wanting to thank her, not just for her military service, but for standing up to Lance's harassment campaign and showing others how to respond to discrimination with dignity rather than aggression. Quiet woman who had arrived in Seattle 3 days earlier as an unknown speaker was leaving as Shadow Strike, a symbol of quiet strength and a leader, ready to help others find their own voices in a world that often tried to silence them. 6 months after the Northwest Military Leadership Council Conference, the story of Shadow Strike had become something far larger than anyone could have anticipated. What began as a local confrontation at a professional conference had evolved into a national conversation about leadership, discrimination, and the value of quiet competence in a world obsessed with self-promotion. Sophia Bennett sat in her new office at the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, D.C., reviewing reports from the pilot program she'd developed for female veteran transition services. The Shadow Strike Protocol, as it had come to be known, was being implemented at VA facilities across the country with remarkable success rates. The program's core principle was elegantly simple: teach female veterans to recognize and articulate their military experience in ways that civilian employers could understand, while providing them with tools to handle discrimination and harassment professionally and effectively. "Ms. Bennett," her assistant called through the intercom, "General Cooper is here for your 2 p.m. meeting." General Cooper entered the office carrying a thick folder and wearing the satisfied expression of someone with good news to deliver. "Shadow Strike," she said, settling into the chair across from Sophia's desk. "I have some updates you're going to want to hear. Good news, I hope." "Better than good," Cooper replied, opening her folder. "The Shadow Strike Protocol has been so successful that the Secretary of Defense wants to expand it to all military branches. We're talking about a comprehensive program that would help female service members transition not just to civilian careers, but to leadership positions in the private sector." Sophia felt a familiar mix of pride and apprehension. The success of her programs was gratifying, but each expansion brought more public attention, something she still struggled with, despite her growing comfort in leadership roles. "There's more," Cooper continued. "Harvard Business School has invited you to deliver the keynote address at their Veterans Leadership Conference next month. The topic is quiet authority, leadership lessons from the battlefield to the boardroom." Before Sophia could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Morrison. The message contained a link to a news article with the headline, "Lance Garrett pleads guilty to filing false federal reports, receives 2-year prison sentence." "I see you've heard about Mr. Garrett," Cooper observed, noticing Sophia's expression as she read the article. 2 years seems harsh," Sophia said quietly, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly sympathetic. "The judge's sentencing statement was quite clear," Cooper replied. "Garrett didn't just file false reports, he attempted to weaponize federal security agencies against a decorated veteran in retaliation for being exposed as a fraud. The court considered it an attack on the integrity of the security clearance system itself." The article went on to detail how Lance's defense contracting company had folded entirely, with several former clients filing civil suits for breach of contract and fraudulent representation. Chad Williams, his former protege, had been fired from his defense industry job and was now working at a sporting goods store in suburban Virginia. But that's not the most interesting part, Cooper added with a slight smile. 3 of Garrett's former clients have reached out to the VA, specifically requesting to work with programs developed by Shadow Strike. They want to ensure their future. Training contracts support actual veterans rather than civilian pretenders. Sophia's phone rang. It was Dr. Rachel Turner from the Seattle conference. "Shadow Strike," Turner said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I have extraordinary news. Next year's Northwest Military Leadership Council Conference has received more than double the usual number of speaker applications. Specifically, we've received over 200 applications from female veterans who want to share their experiences." "That's wonderful," Sophia replied, genuinely pleased. "But here's the remarkable part," Turner continued. "Many of these applications specifically mention your presentation as the inspiration for them to step forward. Women who've been quietly serving in leadership roles for years are finally ready to share their expertise publicly." After hanging up, Sophia walked to her office window, looking out at the Washington skyline. The city buzzed with the constant energy of people convinced that volume equaled importance, that the loudest voice in the room must be the most knowledgeable. But scattered throughout those buildings were quiet professionals, analysts, coordinators, specialists whose calm competence kept the world running while others took credit for their work. Her computer chimed with an email notification. The message was from a young Air Force veteran named Maria Santos, who had just completed the Shadow Strike Protocol program at the Phoenix VA facility. "Ms. Bennett," the email read, "I wanted to thank you for creating this program. For 2 years, after leaving the military, I couldn't get anyone to take my experience seriously. HR managers would look at my resume and see communications specialist without understanding that I coordinated satellite networks for combat operations across 3 time zones. After completing your program, I was able to articulate my experience in terms that civilian employers could understand. Last week, I was hired as a senior operations coordinator for a major logistics company. More importantly, when the hiring manager made some dismissive comments about military wives playing dress up, I was able to respond professionally and educate him about what military service actually entails. The confidence I gained from your program didn't just help me get a job, it helped me find my voice. Thank you for showing us that quiet strength is still strength." Sophia printed the email and added it to the growing folder of similar messages she'd received from program participants. Each story reinforced her belief that the real victory wasn't just her own transformation from dismissed speaker to respected leader. It was the ripple effect of other quiet professionals finding their voices. Her afternoon was filled with meetings about program expansion, budget allocations, and strategic planning. The work was challenging and rewarding, but it was also exhausting in ways that tactical air control had never been. The responsibility of representing all female veterans in policy discussions was heavier than coordinating air support for special operations teams. At least in combat, she thought, success was measured in lives saved and missions accomplished. In Washington, success was measured in committee approvals and budget line items, metrics that felt abstract compared to the immediate feedback of bringing soldiers home safely. But as she reviewed the latest statistics from the Shadow Strike protocol implementations, Sophia realized that this work was saving lives too, just in different ways. Female veterans who might have struggled for years to find meaningful employment were now landing leadership positions in Fortune 500 companies. Women who had been quietly enduring workplace harassment were learning to respond effectively and professionally. The program's success had also attracted attention from civilian organizations dealing with gender discrimination in male-dominated industries. Tech companies, law firms, and financial institutions were adapting Shadow Strike principles to help their female employees navigate hostile work environments. As the day wound down, Sophia received one final phone call that crystallized everything. The past 6 months had meant. "Miss Bennett," came a young voice, nervous but determined. "My name is Lieutenant Sarah Kim, and I'm calling from Fort Bragg. I'm scheduled to leave the Army next month, and I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for female veterans." "Thank you, Lieutenant, but I'm not sure I understand." "Ma'am, 6 months ago, I was terrified about leaving the military. I'd spent 5 years as a logistics coordinator for special operations, but I was convinced that civilian employers would never understand the value of my experience. Then I heard about Shadow Strike and everything you've accomplished." The young woman's voice grew stronger as she continued. "You showed me that quiet competence is actually an advantage in civilian leadership roles. That I don't need to become someone different to be successful. I just need to help others understand who I already am." After the call ended, Sophia sat in her office as darkness fell over Washington. The transformation that had begun with Lance Garrett's attacks in Seattle had become something none of them could have predicted, a movement that was changing how female veterans saw themselves and how the world saw them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new programs to develop, and new opportunities to help quiet professionals find their voices. But tonight, Shadow Strike allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction, knowing that her decision to reveal her call sign had started something that would outlast any individual career or personal ambition. 1 year after the confrontation that changed everything, Sophia Bennett stood once again in the Pacific Northwest Conference Hall, but this time as the keynote speaker for the Northwest Military Leadership Council's annual summit. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same auditorium where she'd been mocked and dismissed now bore a banner reading, "Welcome Shadow Strike, honored guest speaker." The audience of 600 was nearly double the previous year's attendance, drawn by word of mouth about the conference where a quiet veteran had taught everyone the difference between volume and authority. More significantly, nearly 40% of the attendees were female veterans and active duty women, a demographic that had been barely represented the year before. Dr. Rachel Turner introduced Sophia with obvious pride, recounting the events of the previous year and their remarkable aftermath. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to introduce someone who needs no introduction to the military community, the tactical air controller known as Shadow Strike, whose courage in revealing her identity has inspired a generation of quiet leaders to find their voices." As Sophia approached the podium, the same one where she'd been attacked and humiliated, she felt a profound sense of completion. The journey from that moment of revelation to this moment of recognition had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who had seen themselves in her story. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium without any need for projection or emphasis. "A year ago, I stood at this podium as someone very different from who I am today. Not because my capabilities had changed, but because I finally found the courage to let others see who I'd always been." The audience listened with rapt attention, no skeptical murmurs, no hostile energy, just genuine interest in learning from someone they now knew to be among the most qualified people in the room. "The lesson I've learned over the past year," Sophia continued, "isn't that quiet people need to become loud to be successful. It's that organizations and communities need to learn to listen more carefully, to recognize that some of their most valuable insights come from voices that speak softly but carry profound truth." She clicked to her first slide, showing statistics from the Shadow Strike protocol implementations across the country. In the past 12 months, over 3,000 female veterans have completed transition programs based on principles of quiet leadership. Their employment rate in leadership positions is 40% higher than the national average for female veterans, and their retention rate in civilian careers is 60% higher. Colonel Morrison, now a close friend and frequent collaborator, sat in the front row where Lance Garrett had once positioned himself for attack. His presence was a reminder of how much had changed. Where there had once been hostility, there was now alliance and mutual respect. "But the real measure of success," Sophia continued, isn't in statistics. It's in stories like that of Captain Jennifer Walsh, who completed our program and is now the Chief Operations Officer for a major technology company. Or Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, who used quiet leadership principles to revolutionize supply chain management for a Fortune 500 manufacturer. She advanced to the next slide, showing a photograph of herself with a group of female veterans at a recent graduation ceremony. These women didn't need to change who they were to be successful. They needed to learn how to help others recognize the value of who they'd always been. In the audience, Amanda Pierce nodded with understanding. She had become one of the Shadow Strike Protocol's strongest advocates, implementing similar principles in her own consulting work with naval logistics companies. The mistake that many of us make, Sophia said, is thinking that leadership requires us to adopt personas that feel foreign to our natural personalities. We believe we need to be louder, more aggressive, more confrontational to be taken seriously. She paused, her eyes scanning the audience. But some of the most effective leaders in history have been those who commanded respect through competence rather than volume, who built trust through consistency rather than charisma, who influenced others through wisdom rather than intimidation. The presentation continued with detailed case studies of successful quiet leadership implementation in both military and civilian contexts. Sophia shared stories of officers who had revolutionized unit effectiveness by creating environments where all voices were valued, and corporations that had improved performance by recognizing and promoting their quiet but competent professionals. The challenge for organizations, she explained, is creating systems that identify and develop quiet leaders rather than overlooking them in favor of more obvious personalities. This requires intentional effort to seek out diverse perspectives and leadership styles. As the formal presentation concluded, Sophia opened the floor for questions. The difference from the previous year was striking. Instead of hostile challenges to her credibility, the questions were substantive inquiries about implementation strategies and adaptation techniques. Shadow Strike asked a young Air Force captain, "How do you maintain confidence when working in environments that seem designed to favor extroverted leadership styles?" "The key," Sophia replied, "is understanding that confidence isn't about convincing others you're capable. It's about knowing you're capable regardless of whether others recognize it immediately. When you're secure in your competence, you don't need external validation to perform effectively." An older gentleman in the back row raised his hand. "Ms. Bennett, I'm a corporate executive who's been following your work. How can civilian organizations better identify and develop their quiet leaders?" Sophia smiled, recognizing the question as an opportunity to share one of her core insights. Look for the people who consistently deliver results without taking credit, who ask thoughtful questions rather than making obvious statements, and who seem to understand complex situations without needing extensive explanation. Those are often your most valuable leaders. They're just not announcing themselves. As the session ended, Sophia was approached by dozens of attendees, but one conversation stood out. A young woman in Army fatigues approached with obvious nervousness. "Ma'am," she said, "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Chun, and I wanted to thank you personally. I heard about your story when I was considering leaving the military because I didn't think I was cut out for leadership. Your example showed me that there are different ways to lead effectively. What changed your mind about leaving?" Sophia asked. "I realized that I was judging myself by standards that didn't fit who I am," Chun replied. "I thought I needed to be like the loudest officers in my unit to be successful. But after studying your methods, I learned to lead in ways that felt authentic to my personality. My unit's performance improved, and I was selected for promotion ahead of schedule." The conversation continued through the reception that followed, with story after story of people whose lives had been changed by understanding that quiet strength was still strength, that thoughtful leadership was still leadership, and that some of the most important voices in any organization were often the ones that spoke most softly. As the evening wound down, Sophia found herself standing in the same parking lot where she'd questioned whether she belonged at a military leadership conference. Now she understood that the question had never been whether she belonged, it was whether she had the courage to claim her place. The silver pendant she wore beneath her blazer no longer felt like a burden of hidden identity. It had become a symbol of integration, the merging of Shadow Strike, the tactical air controller, with Sophia Bennett, the civilian leader, creating someone who could operate effectively in both worlds. Her phone buzzed with a text message from General Cooper. Watching the live stream from DC. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. You've built something that will outlast all of us. As Sophia drove back to her hotel, she reflected on the journey that had brought her full circle. The woman who had been mocked for her quiet voice had discovered that sometimes the most important words were the ones spoken softly, with precision and purpose. Tomorrow she would return to Washington, to her work with the VA, and to the ongoing mission of helping other quiet professionals find their voices. But tonight, she allowed herself to appreciate how far she'd come from that moment of revelation when Lance Garrett's attacks had forced her to choose between hiding and standing in her truth. She had chosen truth, and that choice had changed everything, not just for her, but for thousands of others who had seen themselves in her story and found the courage to speak their own truths, quietly but with unshakable strength. The legend of Shadow Strike was no longer a secret whispered in classified briefings. It had become a beacon for anyone who had ever been told they were too quiet, too gentle, or too thoughtful to lead. And in conference rooms and boardrooms across the country, quiet voices were rising with new confidence, proving every day that the softest words often carried the greatest power. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.